August 28, 1944, 06:30 hours. Dymchurch Gun Site No. 7, Romney Marsh, England. Sergeant William Hutchins of the Royal Artillery's 413th Battery watched through field glasses as the morning's first V-1 flying bomb crossed the English Channel at 600 km/h, its distinctive pulse jet engine creating the rattling buzz that had terrorized London for 11 weeks. Target acquired. Range 8,000 yards. Bearing 270, called the SCR-584 radar operator, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through every man at the gun position. Hutchins had been firing at these weapons since mid-June. For the first terrible weeks, his gun crew had expended thousands of shells with heartbreaking futility. Conventional time-fused shells required perfect prediction of where the V-1 would be 3 seconds into the future, precise calculation of fuse settings, and mechanical perfection in timing. The mathematics were brutal. 1 degree of error, 1 second of miscalculation, and 2,000 pounds of high explosive did nothing but create black puffs of smoke while Hitler's vengeance weapon continued its deadly flight toward London. But 3 weeks ago, everything had changed. New ammunition had arrived, shells with green bands around their noses and strict orders about handling. No questions asked, no explanations given. Just fire them and watch what happened. "Commence firing," Hutchins ordered. The 3.7-inch gun roared, sending its shell arcing toward the approaching V-1. Through his binoculars, Hutchins watched the trajectory. The shell passed approximately 60 feet from the flying bomb's fuselage. Then it exploded. Not on impact with the ground. Not after a precisely timed fuse burned through. It simply detonated in mid-air, exactly when it sensed proximity to the target, sending hundreds of steel fragments tearing through the V-1's sheet metal skin, severing control lines, and rupturing fuel tanks. The flying bomb pitched nose down and plunged into the channel, its 850 kilograms of amatol explosive detonating harmlessly in salt water half a mile from the English coast. "Splash 1, called the spotter. "Time to intercept, 14 seconds from firing." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 14 miles to the east, at Flak Regiment 155W headquarters in Abbeville, France, Oberstleutnant Max Wachtel stared at the morning's preliminary statistics with growing alarm. His staff had compiled reports from forward observation posts along the French coast, German positions that had been watching British defensive responses to the V-1 offensive since its launch on June 13th. The numbers made no sense. They violated every principle of ballistic probability and anti-aircraft theory that Wachtel had learned at the Luftwaffe's technical academies. 96 V-1s destroyed out of 104 launched. 92% interception rate. "This cannot be accurate," Wachtel said, his finger stabbing at the report. "Check again. There must be errors in observation or reporting." His intelligence officer, a former artillery instructor named Klaus Hoffmann, shook his head slowly. "Herr Oberstleutnant, we have confirmed the reports from 3 separate observation posts. The British are destroying our weapons at rates that should be statistically impossible. They are not making more interceptions by fighters. Those remain constant at approximately 4%. The increase is entirely from anti-aircraft fire." Wachtel walked to the window overlooking the chateau grounds. In the distance, he could hear the pulse jet engines of V-1s being prepared for the next launch wave. Each weapon represented months of development, thousands of Reichsmarks in resources, and the labour of hundreds of workers in underground factories. They were supposed to bring Britain to its knees, to make the island nation sue for peace, to prove that German technology could strike London with impunity, despite the Allied invasion of France. Instead, they were falling from the sky at rates that defied explanation. "What has changed?" Wachtel demanded. "Our observers reported 17% destruction rates in June. By mid-July, it had climbed to 46%. Last week, 79%. Now 92%. The British have not deployed significantly more guns. Fighter interceptions remain the same. What are they doing differently?" Hoffman consulted his notes. Our observers report that the anti-aircraft shells are behaving strangely. They are not seeing the usual pattern of near misses and occasional direct hits. Instead, they witness shells exploding near the V-1s without making contact, yet the weapons are being destroyed. Some observers believe the British have developed a new type of fuse, perhaps something triggered by radio signals or proximity to the target. Wachtel turned sharply. Proximity fuses. That is science fiction. The technical challenges would be insurmountable. A radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit in an artillery shell, robust enough to survive being fired, sensitive enough to detect an aircraft, and reliable enough to detonate at exactly the right moment. The Reich's research institutions attempted this years ago and concluded it was impossible with current technology. Nevertheless, Herr Oberstleutnant, that is what our observers are reporting. They describe a pattern of airbursts occurring at optimal distance from our weapons, far more effective than conventional fuses could achieve. What neither Wachtel nor any German intelligence officer knew was that they were witnessing the combat effectiveness of one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets, a technology so revolutionary that Winston Churchill had ordered its security classification placed at the same level as the atomic bomb project. The VT fuse, officially designated as the variable time fuse to mislead enemy intelligence, was not a timing mechanism at all. It was a miniature radar system crammed into an artillery shell, capable of sensing its proximity to targets and detonating at the optimal moment for maximum lethality. The weapon represented a leap in technology so profound that German scientists, even when they later captured intact examples in Belgium, would examine them and conclude they were impossible. They had the future in their hands and couldn't comprehend it. The story of how Britain was saved from Hitler's vengeance weapon began not in 1944, but 5 years earlier in the desperate autumn of 1939, when a young British scientist named William Butemant conceived an idea that would transform warfare forever. October 1939. The Air Defence Research and Development Establishment, Christchurch, England. As the first winter of war settled over Britain, Butemant and his colleagues Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson worked on a problem that haunted every military planner in London. How do you shoot down aircraft that fly faster and higher than anything in the previous war? The mathematics were grim. During the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 8,500 shells for each enemy aircraft destroyed. By 1939, with aircraft flying at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour and altitudes reaching 20,000 feet, the ratio had worsened dramatically. British air defence was essentially firing shotguns at supersonic targets and hoping for lucky hits. Butemant's solution seemed like science fiction. Instead of requiring gunners to predict exactly where an aircraft would be seconds into the future, why not create a shell that could sense when it was near an aircraft and detonate automatically? The concept emerged from radio wave theory. If a shell contained a miniature radio transmitter broadcasting signals continuously, those signals would bounce off nearby aircraft. If the shell could detect these reflected signals and measure their changing strength, it could determine when it had reached optimal proximity to the target and trigger detonation without requiring perfect aim. The idea was brilliant. The execution seemed impossible with 1939 technology. Butemant needed to miniaturize a complete radio system, including transmitter, receiver, power source, and detonator mechanism, into a space smaller than a coffee can. That system would need to survive being fired from a gun at forces exceeding 20,000 times normal gravity, spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute, and still maintain the sensitivity to detect aircraft 70 feet away while rejecting false signals from the ground, rain, or debris. By June 1940, as France collapsed and the Luftwaffe prepared to bomb Britain into submission, Butemant and his team had constructed working prototypes. Tests against balloon targets proved the concept viable, but revealed the crushing reality. No electronic components then in existence could survive the violence of being fired from a conventional gun. The solution would come from across the Atlantic, delivered during Britain's darkest hour by one of history's most important and least known scientific missions. September 6, 1940, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond arrived carrying cargo more valuable than gold or weapons. Sir Henry Tizard stepped ashore carrying a single black metal deed box that contained Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. The Tizard mission, as historians would later call it, represented a gamble born from desperation. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe was bombing London nightly. Invasion seemed imminent. In this moment of maximum peril, Britain made an extraordinary decision. Share every military secret with the United States, a nation not yet at war, in hopes that American industrial might and scientific resources could transform British concepts into war-winning weapons. The delegation assembled in Washington on September 12th, taking residence at the Wardman Park Hotel. For 1 week, they systematically revealed Britain's technological treasures to American military and scientific leaders: advanced radar systems that could detect aircraft 100 miles away, jet engine designs that promised to revolutionize aviation, explosive technologies developed in secret laboratories, research into chemical weapons and countermeasures. But on September 19th, in a conference room overlooking Connecticut Avenue, British physicist Dr. John Cockcroft presented something special to a young American physicist who had been summoned specifically for this meeting. Dr. Merle Tuve sat transfixed as Cockcroft explained British proximity fuse research. Tuve, 39 years old, had grown up in rural South Dakota, the son of Norwegian immigrants. He had spent his childhood building crystal radio sets alongside his friend Ernest Lawrence, who would later win the Nobel Prize for inventing the cyclotron. Tuve himself had become one of America's leading physicists, pioneering research in nuclear physics and radio wave propagation. Just 1 month earlier, in August 1940, Vannevar Bush had appointed Tuve to lead a new secret section of the National Defense Research Committee. Section T was created with a single purpose: develop proximity fuses for American artillery and anti-aircraft weapons. Tuve's appointment hadn't been random. Throughout August 1940, he had listened to radio broadcasts from London describing the Blitz, reports of children being pulled from rubble, entire neighbourhoods obliterated in minutes, the desperate inadequacy of British air defences. Tuve had turned to his wife Winnie with tears in his eyes. "We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to provide the answer." Now Cockcroft was handing him exactly that opportunity, along with an honest assessment of British limitations. They had the concept and working prototypes, but lacked the industrial capacity, resources, and time to transform laboratory curiosities into mass-produced weapons. America, with its vast industrial base and geography protected by 2 oceans, represented the only hope. Tuve left the meeting with a mission that would consume the next 5 years of his life and mobilize the entire American electronics industry. The challenge seemed impossible, but then so did stopping Hitler. December 1940. Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Carnegie Institution, Washington, District of Columbia. The mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road had been hastily converted into the nerve center of America's newest weapons program. Tuve assembled a team that would reshape warfare itself. Richard Roberts, a nuclear physicist who had worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, Henry Porter, an expert in acoustics and wave propagation, Robert Broad, who had studied cosmic ray physics, Lawrence Hafstad, a specialist in nuclear physics, Lloyd Berkner, a pioneer in ionospheric research, and a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would make him famous, but whose wartime contribution would remain classified for decades. The challenge they faced defied every assumption about electronics and miniaturization. A proximity fuse would need to be a complete radar system: transmitter, receiver, amplifier, processor, and detonator, compressed into a space barely 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. It would need to generate radio waves at frequencies over 180 MHz, detect their reflection from metal aircraft, process these signals while spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute, and trigger detonation at exactly the right moment. All of this while surviving acceleration forces that would turn a human body into liquid. James Van Allen took on the most fundamental challenge, creating vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a gun. Traditional vacuum tubes, with their delicate glass envelopes and fragile filaments hanging from thin wires, shattered at forces of just 100 times normal gravity. The proximity fuse would need tubes that could survive forces 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked with Raytheon, a Massachusetts company that manufactured hearing aids. They borrowed miniaturization techniques from hearing aid production, creating tubes with rigid construction that eliminated the hanging filaments that made conventional tubes so fragile. The breakthrough came in January 1942. Van Allen developed what he called the mousetrap spring mechanism, a mechanical system that clamped the tube filament rigidly during the massive acceleration of firing, protecting it from the brutal G-forces, then released it for normal operation once the shell was in flight. The patent for this device would remain classified until 1947, but it represented one of the most important electronic innovations of the war. Lloyd Berkner achieved another crucial breakthrough in circuit design. He developed a system that used separate oscillator and detector functions, allowing the fuse to detect targets at greater distances with higher reliability than the British autodyne concept. His innovation meant American proximity fuses could sense aircraft at 70 feet instead of the 30 feet that British designs achieved. By March 1942, the project had outgrown Carnegie's facilities. Johns Hopkins University established the Applied Physics Laboratory in an abandoned Chevrolet dealership at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building still smelled of motor oil and tire rubber when the first scientists arrived, but within weeks it housed the most advanced electronics laboratory in the world. Tuve became APL's first director, establishing a laboratory culture that would define American weapons development for decades. Signs appeared throughout the building that captured his philosophy. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure, regardless of who is technically responsible." The technical specifications of what they achieved still seem remarkable even by modern standards. The Mark 32 proximity fuse, designed for 5-inch naval guns, operated as a continuous wave radar transmitting at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz. The projectile's metal shell body served as the transmitting antenna, excited by a small conical antenna in the nose. Inside a space barely larger than a soup can, they packed 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, including resistors, capacitors, and transformers, a reserve battery using revolutionary liquid electrolyte technology, safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation, and the detonator system itself. The oscillator tube generated radio waves at 70 MHz with harmonics at the target frequency. When these waves bounced off approaching aircraft, they created interference patterns that varied the oscillator loading, producing beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 Hz range. These signals indicated a target's presence and approach rate. They were amplified through a 2-stage amplifier, filtered for the specific frequencies that indicated a closing target, then used to trigger a thyrotron gas-filled tube that initiated the detonator. The power source represented another seemingly impossible innovation. Traditional batteries couldn't survive the G-forces or provide sufficient power in such a small space. The solution came from National Carbon Company, which developed a reserve battery using liquid electrolyte stored in a glass ampule. The firing shock would shatter the ampule and centrifugal force from the shell's rotation would drive the electrolyte into stacked carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery during flight. This meant the battery had unlimited shelf life before use but provided full power exactly when needed, a crucial advantage given that thousands of shells might sit in magazines for months before being fired. Safety systems prevented premature detonation through multiple redundant mechanisms. Centrifugal switches remained open until the shell reached proper spin rate, typically around 3,000 revolutions per minute. A half-second to 7/10 of a second arming delay after firing prevented detonation near friendly forces. The sensitivity increased gradually during flight, reaching maximum effectiveness at typical engagement ranges of 3,000 to 8,000 yards. By December 1942, the proximity fuse had progressed from concept to working prototype to limited production. The first combat test would come in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese air attacks threatened to overwhelm American naval forces defending Guadalcanal. January 5, 1943. 0800 hours. Southwest Pacific, near Guadalcanal. USS Helena's air search radar detected incoming contacts at 40 miles. 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers approaching at 12,000 feet, part of a Japanese attack force targeting American ships supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. Lieutenant Russell Cochran, commanding Helena's aft 5-inch battery, had been briefed on the new ammunition just 3 days before. The instructions were explicit. Shells marked with green bands represented experimental ammunition. Use only against aircraft. Maintain absolute security about their capabilities. Report results immediately. In the magazine below deck, gunners loaded shells marked with those distinctive green bands. They had no idea they were loading history's first smart weapons, artillery shells that could think. Range 8,000 yards and closing, called the rangefinder operator, his voice betraying the tension every sailor felt when Japanese aircraft approached. For the past year, American anti-aircraft fire had been woefully inadequate. Shoot-down rates remained below 5%. Ships would fire hundreds of rounds, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding shells, and watch helplessly as Japanese bombers pressed their attacks through the barrage. "Commence firing," Cochran ordered. The first salvo erupted from Helena's guns. The shells traced red arcs across the Farans, tropical morning sky, passing near the lead valve. Nothing happened. They were still too distant, beyond the 70-foot sensing range of the proximity fuses. 15 seconds later, the second salvo fired. At 5,000 yards from Helena, 11,000 feet altitude, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber's fuselage. The explosion looked different from anything Cochran had seen in 13 months of combat. Instead of the shell continuing past the aircraft or requiring a direct hit, it detonated in mid-air, sending a perfect sphere of steel fragments expanding outward at supersonic velocity. The valve's port wing sheared off instantly. The engine, peppered with hundreds of fragments, burst into flames. The aircraft didn't break apart dramatically, like in Hollywood films. It simply ceased being an aircraft, transforming from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling mass of burning aluminum and fabric falling toward the ocean. "Splash one," called the spotter, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The remaining 3 Vals broke off their attack run, attempting to maneuver away from Helena's fire. The gun directors tracked them smoothly, the radar-controlled systems maintaining perfect aim despite the aircraft's evasive actions. 3 more salvos, 12 more shells. At 6,000 yards, a shell detonated 40 feet below the second valve's fuselage. The upward-directed fragments pierced fuel tanks and severed control cables. The pilot slumped forward, killed instantly by fragments that had passed through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. The valve spiraled into the ocean, trailing black smoke. In Helena's radio room, the combat report was already being encoded for transmission to Pacific Fleet headquarters. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the dry military language didn't capture was the psychological impact on Helena's gun crews. Gunner's mate, First Class Anthony Puzo, later wrote to his family, "We couldn't believe it. For months we'd fired thousands of rounds at Jap planes, maybe hitting one if we were incredibly lucky. Now we were knocking them down with just a few shots. The guys were saying it was like God himself was guiding our shells." The news flashed through the Pacific Fleet with stunning speed. Within days, every admiral and captain wanted these miraculous new shells. But production was still limited, security was absolute, and the technology remained so secret that even gun crews firing the rounds weren't told how they worked. August 12, 1942, months before Helena's combat success, USS Cleveland had conducted tests that convinced the Navy to stake everything on proximity fuses. In Chesapeake Bay, the cruiser faced 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft flying realistic attack patterns. The test was scheduled for 2 days of controlled experiments. It lasted less than 2 hours. First drone, destroyed with the second burst of proximity-fused shells. Second drone eliminated on the 4th burst. Third drone obliterated on the 1st burst. The shells had proven so devastatingly effective that Navy observers immediately cancelled the remaining tests and ordered immediate mass production. Admiral William Blandy, watching from Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide with a statement that would prove prophetic. "This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific needs these rounds immediately." But mass production of the world's most complex electronic device would require transforming America's entire electronics industry, mobilizing tens of thousands of workers, and creating manufacturing processes that didn't yet exist. It would also require maintaining absolute secrecy about technology so revolutionary that Germany and Japan, even when they captured intact examples, would examine them and conclude they were impossible. The proximity fuse's journey from laboratory prototype to war-winning weapon would require an industrial mobilization that demonstrated why totalitarian regimes, for all their propaganda about efficiency and organization, couldn't match democratic nations when those nations fully committed to total war. By spring 1943, proximity fuses were flowing to the Pacific Fleet in quantities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The first 5,000 rounds went to USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the personal supervision of Commander William Parsons, the same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay over Hiroshima. Security protocols were extraordinary. The shells were stored in special magazines under armed guard. Only gunnery officers received briefings on their capabilities, and even those briefings omitted technical details. Crew members were told they were firing special incendiary rounds, an explanation that covered the green band markings and different handling procedures, without revealing their true nature. The statistical transformation was immediate and undeniable. During 1943, although proximity fuses comprised only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition fired by American ships, they accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The rounds per kill ratio dropped from 500 for conventional time-fused shells to just 155 for proximity-fused ammunition, better than a 3-fold improvement. Gunner's Mate Second Class Robert Chen, serving aboard USS Essex, documented the change in his personal diary. March 1943. Fired 300 rounds at attacking Bettys. No hits. Everyone frustrated. September 1943. New ammunition arrived with green bands. Fired 80 rounds at attacking Vals. Destroyed 3. The guys think we've gotten better at shooting. They don't know it's the shells doing the thinking now. June 19th, 1944. 1000 hours. Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Guam. Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of USS Washington, the same James Van Allen who had developed the shock-proof vacuum tubes that made proximity fuses possible. He had been commissioned as a naval officer in November 1942 and spent 16 months training gunnery crews throughout the Pacific Fleet. Now he would witness his invention's ultimate test, the radar screens filled with approaching contacts. The Japanese had launched their entire remaining carrier aviation strength, 423 aircraft, in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet supporting the invasion of Saipan and Guam. Every ship in Task Force 58 was loaded with proximity-fused ammunition. Van Allen knew the theoretical effectiveness, but theory and combat were different realities. Raid 1, bearing 265, Angels 20, 69 aircraft, announced the combat. Information Center, using military terminology for altitude in thousands of feet, Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered, "Launch all fighters, gun crews to battle stations." As Hellcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations, those aircraft that broke through the fighter screen faced something unprecedented in naval warfare. Every ship in the task force, from battleships to destroyers, opened fire with proximity-fused ammunition, creating a wall of air-bursting shells that turned the sky into a killing zone. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky filled with black puffs, each one representing a proximity-fused detonation at exactly the optimal distance from a Japanese aircraft. Planes began falling like rain. A Zero fighter dove on USS South Dakota, 1,000 yards from Washington. Van Allen watched South Dakota's 5-inch guns track smoothly, firing measured 3-round bursts. The third shell detonated approximately 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't explode, dramatically. It simply came apart, wings separating from fuselage, engine falling free, the pilot's body tumbling through space, still strapped to his seat. It was systematic slaughter, Van Allen would later write to his wife. The proximity fuses turned our ships into fortresses. The Japanese pilots were incredibly brave. They kept coming even as their squadrons were annihilated around them. But courage couldn't overcome technology. We had given our gunners the ability to think at the speed of radio waves. By day's end, the statistics told a story of complete air superiority achieved through technological advantage. The Japanese had lost 315 carrier aircraft, plus another 50 land-based planes, essentially their entire remaining trained carrier aviation force. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, mostly from operational accidents rather than combat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas, Turkey Shoot, effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a meaningful force. They would never again launch a conventional carrier strike. Their next major aerial tactic would be born from complete desperation. Kamikaze attacks that accepted the pilot's death as the price of reaching the target. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Aboard USS Bunker Hill, aviation radioman Charles Calhoun recorded his impressions. We could see them falling everywhere, in flames, in pieces, some intact but dead, just falling. The gunners were laughing and crying at the same time. After 2 years of taking it from Japanese air attacks, being helpless while they bombed and torpedoed us, we were finally giving it back. The proximity fuses made our guns almost godlike. But the proximity fuse's greatest test in defending ships would come in the waters around Okinawa, where Japanese desperation would birth a new horror. Kamikaze, the divine wind, turned pilots into guided missiles, and even the miracle of proximity fuses would be tested to their absolute limits. October 25th, 1944, 0740 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts watched in horror from USS White Plains as a Zero fighter, already burning from multiple anti-aircraft hits, deliberately crashed into USS St. Louis' flight deck. The explosion detonated torpedo warheads stored in the hangar deck. Within 30 minutes, St. Louis rolled over and sank, the first major American warship lost to kamikaze attack. The Japanese had discovered the only tactical counter to proximity fuses. If a conventional attack required the aircraft to survive long enough to drop bombs or launch torpedoes, and proximity fuses made survival impossible, then eliminate the requirement for survival. Turn the pilot into part of the weapon. A plane destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed its mission. A kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target would still crash into the ship through momentum and physics. The divine wind had begun, and it would test American technology and resolve as nothing else in the Pacific War. Statistical analysis revealed the tactical revolution that proximity fuses had forced upon Japanese commanders. Conventional Japanese air attacks launched between October 1944 and January 1945 achieved only 2% success rates. 23 hits from 1,092 attack attempts. The proximity fuse had made traditional dive bombing and torpedo attacks essentially suicidal missions with negligible chance of success. Kamikaze attacks achieved 34% success rates, 121 hits from 352 attempts. When you accepted the pilot's death as inevitable, when you loaded the aircraft with explosives and aimed the entire plane at the target, proximity fuses that would have saved you from conventional attacks became merely another hazard to overcome, not a mission killer. But even against kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses proved invaluable. During the Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills, or successful deflections from 364 kamikaze attempts, a 64% defensive success rate. Proximity fuses accounted for 44% of all 5-inch gun kills. Without them, American casualties would have doubled or tripled. Gunner's mate William Fombe, serving aboard USS Nashville, described the new reality with brutal clarity. The Japs came at us like they didn't care about living anymore, because they didn't. Our proximity fuses would blow them to pieces, but the pieces kept coming. We'd turn a whole plane into confetti, metal and body parts flying everywhere, but confetti travelling at 300 miles per hour still. Hits hard. The fuses saved us from most of them, but the ones that got through, God help those ships. Radar Picket Station 15, 60 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Baron Mullaney of USS Hadley watched the radar screen with a dread born from experience. Kikusui No. 6 was incoming, the sixth of 10 massive kamikaze operations the Japanese would launch against the Okinawa invasion fleet. Over 150 aircraft in coordinated waves, and Hadley stood alone with USS Hugh W. Hadley at the picket station, the fleet's early warning system and first line of defense. Multiple raids, all vectors. Estimated 150-plus bandits, reported the Combat Information Center, using military terminology for hostile aircraft. Mullaney had drilled his crew relentlessly since arriving at Okinawa. Every man knew his job. The 5-inch magazines were loaded entirely with proximity-fused shells. The gun crews had practiced until they could maintain 15 rounds per minute per gun, the maximum sustainable rate that wouldn't destroy the barrels or exhaust the crews. At 15:20 hours, the first wave attacked, 12 aircraft from the north, a mixture of Zeros and Vals flying in loose formation. Hadley's forward guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. The proximity fuses began their deadly work with mechanical efficiency. First plane destroyed at 8,000 yards, the shell detonating 40 feet from the aircraft's cockpit, killing the pilot instantly and sending the Zero spinning into the ocean. Second plane destroyed at 6,000 yards. Third at 4,000 yards, so close that debris from the explosion showered Hadley's forward deck. The fourth kamikaze, already burning from proximity fuse hits, crashed 50 yards off the starboard beam. The explosion showered the ship with flaming aviation gasoline and metal fragments, but caused no serious damage. The proximity fuses had killed the pilot and damaged the aircraft enough that it couldn't maintain controlled flight for those final crucial yards. But this was just the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, Hadley fought for survival against continuous waves of attackers coming from every direction, high and low, singly and in groups. The gun barrels glowed red-hot from sustained firing. Ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced by cooks, clerks, anyone who could lift shells. The proximity fuses never stopped working, never hesitated, never failed. Gunner's mate Second Class Robert Ely, manning Gun Mount 52, later provided testimony that captured the rhythm of technological warfare. They came from everywhere, high, low, all directions at once. The proximity fuses were beautiful to watch. We'd fire, and 3 seconds later there'd be an explosion and burning pieces falling. Fire again. Another explosion. It was like a rhythm. Boom, boom, boom from our guns. Wait 3 seconds. Explosion in the sky. Boom, boom, boom. Explosion. Over and over. At 16:15 hours, Hadley's extraordinary luck ran out. 3 kamikazes, all heavily damaged by proximity fuse explosions but still flying on momentum and dying pilot determination, crashed into the ship in quick succession. A bomb from a 4th aircraft that had been blown apart by a proximity fuse fell free and exploded in the after engine room. Hadley was devastated. 30 dead, 68 wounded. Engineering spaces flooded, fires raging in 3 compartments, power lost to half the ship. But the forward guns kept fighting. Even as damage control parties fought fires and flooding, even as wounded men were being carried below, the gun crews continued engaging attacking aircraft with proximity-fused ammunition. When the action finally ended at 16:55 hours, Hadley had shot down 23 aircraft, an all-time record for a destroyer in a single engagement. The ship was a floating wreck, but it had survived, and the gun crews credited their survival to one thing above all others. Commander Mullaney's after-action report stated with characteristic understatement, "The proximity fuse was indispensable to our survival. Without it, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes. Even damaged and burning, even with half our systems knocked out, the proximity fuses allowed us to continue defending ourselves when conventional ammunition would have been useless against such numbers." The Okinawa campaign's final statistics were sobering even in victory. 1,900 Japanese aircraft launched in kamikaze attacks, 368 American ships damaged, 34 sunk, 4,907 sailors killed, 4,824 wounded, the bloodiest naval campaign in American history. Yet post-war analysis by the Naval Historical Center concluded that without proximity fuses, casualties have exceeded 15,000 dead with over 100 ships sunk. The proximity fuse had made the difference between painful victory and potential catastrophic defeat. It had saved the Okinawa invasion and, by extension, saved the lives of countless soldiers and Marines who would have died if the invasion had failed and the war had continued. While proximity fuses were saving American ships in the Pacific, they were simultaneously saving London from Hitler's vengeance weapon, the V-1 flying bomb that German propaganda promised would bring Britain to its knees. June 13, 1944, 0400 hours, London. The distinctive pulse jet engine sound echoed across the city for the first time in months, a harsh buzzing that Londoners had learned to dread during test flights earlier in the war. The first V-1 flying bomb of the main offensive impacted in Grove Road, Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians. Mrs. Carrie Harrison became the first London victim of what Hitler called his vengeance weapon. When Britain had been essentially helpless against massed bomber attacks, London now possessed a defence system that would have seemed miraculous just years earlier. A defence system centred on American technology that German intelligence insisted was impossible. On June 12th, one day before the V-1 offensive began and exactly 6 days after D-Day, Winston Churchill had made a decision that would save thousands of British lives. Against the advice of security officials who feared the technology would fall into German hands if unexploded shells landed in areas the Germans might recapture, Churchill authorised the use of proximity fuses for London's defence. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, had deployed 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns in a defensive belt south of London, British 3.7-inch guns and American 90mm weapons, each linked to SCR 584 microwave radar systems and M9 electronic gun directors, creating an automated defensive network. But without proximity fuses, even this sophisticated system achieved only 24% success rates during the first week of V-1 attacks. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, serving in the filter room at Royal Air Force Stanmore, tracked the transformation with growing amazement. The first week was absolutely terrifying. We'd plot dozens of V-1s approaching London and watch helplessly as most got through our defences. The guns were firing constantly, thousands upon thousands of rounds, but hitting almost nothing. Then something changed in the second week. Suddenly, the guns started destroying everything. The plotting board showed Vone after Vone disappearing 10 miles from London, eliminated before they could reach the city. What Hill witnessed was the arrival of proximity fuses flown directly from American production lines to British gun positions. American cargo aircraft were landing at British airfields daily, carrying nothing but proximity fuses packed in special containers. The shells went directly from aircraft to trucks to gun positions, bypassing normal supply chains entirely. Churchill had given the order, "Get them to the guns immediately. Every hour of delay means dead civilians." By the second week of the Vone offensive, British and American gunners were destroying 46% of engaged flying bombs. Third week, 67%. Fourth week, 79%. The improvement was so dramatic that German intelligence reported to Hitler that the British must have developed a revolutionary new secret weapon for air defense. They were right, but they had no idea what they were facing. German observers watching from the French coast could see the results, but couldn't understand the mechanism. V-1s would be flying steadily toward England, then suddenly be surrounded by anti-aircraft bursts. Instead of requiring the impossible direct hit that conventional fuses demanded, these mysterious shells were exploding near the flying bombs and destroying them anyway. Gunner Sergeant Kenneth Brown of the American 184th AAA Gun Battalion, stationed near Biggin Hill, described the transformation in a letter home. "With regular shells, we had to predict exactly where the buzz bomb would be 3 seconds into the future. 1 second off, 1 degree wrong in our calculations, and we'd miss completely. With the new ammunition, we just had to get close. The shell would do the rest. It was like going from throwing darts blindfolded to throwing them with your eyes open." On August 28, 1944, the defensive system achieved its ultimate success, the day that would haunt Oberstleutnant Wachtel and prove to German intelligence that something revolutionary had happened to British air defense capabilities. Early warning radar detected 104 V-1s launched at London in coordinated waves from sites in France. The proximity-fused coastal gun belt destroyed 96. Royal Air Force fighters intercepted 4 more during their flight over the Channel. Only 4 V-1s reached London that day, and 3 of those were destroyed by the inner gun belt before causing significant damage. The final statistics for the Vone campaign against London told the story of technological supremacy. 9,300 Vone missiles launched over 80 days, approximately 2,340 destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Without this defense, estimated additional casualties would have exceeded 20,000 dead and 50,000 wounded. Central London might have been evacuated, war production disrupted, civilian morale shattered at the crucial moment when Allied forces were fighting in France. Churchill would later write in his memoirs, "The proximity fuse, more than any other single development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs. It was American genius applied to British desperation, and it worked beyond our most optimistic predictions." The defence of London proved the proximity fuse's value, but an even more critical battle was being fought over the port of Antwerp in Belgium, where the entire Allied advance into Germany depended on a single logistics lifeline that Hitler was determined to cut. December 15, 1944, Antwerp, Belgium. Captain William Hartmann of the 407th AAA Gun Battalion reviewed the previous day's statistics with grim satisfaction. In 24 hours, his battalion had destroyed 89 of 92 V-1s targeted at Antwerp harbour, a 97% success rate that would have been dismissed as propaganda fantasy just months earlier. Antwerp was the vital lung through which the Allied armies in Europe breathed. Through its 26 miles of docks flowed 25,000 tons of supplies daily. Food for millions of soldiers, ammunition for thousands of guns, fuel for tens of thousands of vehicles, medical supplies for hundreds of field hospitals. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance into Germany would strangle for lack of logistics. Hitler understood Antwerp's strategic importance as clearly as Eisenhower did. Between October 24th, 1944, and March 27th, 1945, Germany would launch 4,900 V-1s at Antwerp, more than half the number they had fired at London. If they could close the port, even temporarily, they could stop the Allied advance and buy time for Germany to develop new weapons or achieve a negotiated peace. The defence of Antwerp had started poorly. In early November, conventional time-fused shells achieved only 40% success rates. V-1s were impacting the port area at a rate of 30 per day, damaging docks, sinking ships, killing dock workers, and threatening to make the port unusable. Then, in mid-December, a Lancaster bomber made an emergency landing at Antwerp airport. Its cargo was more precious than gold. 10,000 proximity fuses flown directly from production facilities in Cincinnati on Churchill's personal order. Get them to Antwerp immediately. The entire campaign depends on keeping that port open. Technical Sergeant Joseph Kovac, operating an SCR 584 radar unit, witnessed the immediate transformation. Before proximity fuses, we'd track a buzz bomb perfectly, feed perfect firing data to the guns, and watch our shells explode behind it, in front of it, above it, below it, everywhere except on the target. After proximity fuses arrived, same tracking, same data, but now every gunburst meant a dead buzz bomb falling into the channel or the countryside. It was like someone had given us guided missiles. The German V-1 crews launching from sites in Holland couldn't understand what had happened. Launch sites that had successfully delivered 80% of their missiles to Antwerp suddenly saw 90% destroyed in flight. They increased launch rates, firing more missiles to saturate the defences. They varied launch times, trying day attacks and night attacks. They experimented with different flight altitudes. Nothing worked. The proximity fuses destroyed them all with mechanical, merciless efficiency. Private First Class Raymond Miller, ammunition handler with the 126th AAA Battalion, described the reality of sustained operations. We were firing so many proximity fuses that we ran out of storage space. Trucks would arrive from the port carrying new shells, drive straight to the gun positions, and we'd load them directly into the guns. No inventory counts, no paperwork, just shoot, shoot, shoot. In one 24-hour period, my gun position fired 1,400 rounds. That's 1,400 proximity fuses, each one a miracle of engineering. And electronics burned through in one day to keep the port open. By February 1945, the defence had become so effective that German V-1 crews began suffering morale collapse. Luftwaffe Colonel Max Wachtel, who had commanded the V-1 offensive from its beginning, reported to Hitler that continuing attacks on Antwerp were feeding missiles into a furnace for no gain whatsoever. Hitler ordered the attacks to continue regardless of casualties or results. German propaganda needed the V-1 campaign to appear successful. They did continue, achieving nothing except depleting Germany's dwindling resources and manufacturing capacity. The final statistics for Antwerp's defence demonstrated technological dominance that bordered on the absolute. 2,183 V-1s destroyed out of 2,394 engaged. 91.2% success rate. The port never closed. The supplies never stopped flowing. The Allied armies continued their advance into Germany, sustained by the logistics lifeline that proximity fuses had kept open. While proximity fuses were saving London and Antwerp from flying bombs, they remained prohibited for ground combat use due to security concerns. If German forces overran American positions and captured intact proximity fuses, they might be able to copy the technology or develop countermeasures. That prohibition would hold until German desperation created a crisis that forced American commanders to make a fateful decision. December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. Monschau, Germany. Colonel Oskar Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group received frantic reports from forward observers. German forces were attacking in overwhelming strength through the Ardennes forest. The 38th Cavalry Squadron holding the line near Monschau was outnumbered 10-1, Without immediate artillery support, they would be overrun within hours. Axelson faced a terrible decision. In his ammunition bunkers sat thousands of proximity-fused shells delivered just days before, with strict orders stamped in red on every container. Not to be used in ground combat under any circumstances. Risk of capture by enemy forces too great. But without those shells, the cavalry squadron would be annihilated and German forces would pour through the gap in American lines. At 0600 hours, Axelson gave the order that would revolutionize ground warfare and save countless American lives. Load proximity fuses, set for airburst. The first salvo landed among German infantry, advancing across snow-covered fields near Hofen. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground, allowing soldiers in foxholes to survive by pressing themselves into the earth, the shells detonated at optimal height above the ground, 20 to 30 feet up, precisely calculated to maximize the lethal cone of fragments raining downward. The effect was apocalyptic. Fragments rained downward in killing patterns that reached into foxholes, behind walls, under vehicles, into trenches. There was no cover, no protection, nowhere to hide from steel fragments falling from the sky at supersonic velocity. Forward observer Lieutenant Richard Rolston, watching through binoculars from a church steeple, reported back to Axelson. First salvo airburst over German infantry company in open ground. Estimate 80% casualties. Survivors running back toward the woodline. Request immediate repeat fire on the woodline. The second salvo airburst in the trees where German soldiers sought cover. The combination of shell fragments and wood splinters created a killing zone 100 yards deep into the forest. Centuries-old trees, their trunks 2 feet thick, were shredded. Branches fell like spears. German soldiers, veterans of 4 years of combat on the eastern and western fronts, men who had survived Stalingrad and Normandy, experienced something entirely new and terrifying. Artillery that killed regardless of cover or concealment. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division survived the barrage and was captured 2 days later. His interrogation report, preserved in the National Archives, captured the psychological impact. The artillery was unlike anything we had experienced in Russia or Normandy. We dove into foxholes as we had been trained, but the shells exploded above us, and the fragments came down like rain. We ran to the forest where trees should have protected us, but the shells followed us and exploded in the treetops. Men were screaming that the Americans had a new secret weapon that could see through earth and wood. Entire platoons were eliminated in seconds. We could not fight what we could not understand. Word of Axelson's success spread through American command channels with remarkable speed. By December 19th, Eisenhower had formally requested permission from Washington to use proximity fuses across the entire European front. Authorization came on December 21st. Within hours, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes was firing proximity-fused shells, and German soldiers were dying in numbers that defied their commander's understanding of artillery effectiveness. General George Patton, never known for understatement, wrote to the War Department on December 28th with typical bluntness. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. The other night we caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. We hit them with proximity fuses, battalion time on target fire. By actual count the next morning, 702 dead." The few survivors were so demoralized they surrendered immediately without resistance. "This is a magnificent weapon," he added prophetically. "I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some entirely new method of warfare. I am damned glad you all thought of it first." The proximity fuse that was revolutionizing battlefields from the Pacific to Europe, from air defense to ground combat, began its life in the most unlikely places. Converted bakeries, former automobile garages, Christmas light factories, radio manufacturing plants. The transformation of laboratory prototype into mass-produced weapon represented one of the greatest industrial achievements in history, and one that only American industrial capacity could have accomplished in wartime. By late 1942, the challenge seemed insurmountable to anyone who understood electronics. Each proximity fuse required 130 precision components that had never been mass-produced before. The miniature vacuum tubes alone required manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The entire assembly had to be perfect. A single failed component meant a dud shell that might explode prematurely, killing American soldiers instead of protecting them. The industrial mobilization began with Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio. Powell Crosley Jr., who had made his fortune selling affordable radios and refrigerators to American families during the Depression, converted his entire manufacturing facility to proximity fuse production in a matter of weeks. By January 1943, assembly lines were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing an average of 8,000 fuses daily. Betty Morrison, who worked on the assembly line at Crosley from 1943 to 1945, recalled in a 1995 interview the extraordinary security that shrouded the work. "We didn't know what we were making. Security was unbelievable. We were searched entering and leaving the plant. No purses, no bags, nothing that could be used to smuggle components out. We sat at benches 8 hours a day, soldering tiny components onto circuit boards smaller than playing cards. The supervisors told us we were making radio parts for aircraft. It was only after the war ended that we learned we'd been building the proximity fuses that saved so many of our boys from Japanese kamikazes and German artillery." The production numbers escalated at rates that defied comprehension. December 1942, 500 units produced daily. June 1943, 8,000 daily. December 1943, 40,000 daily. By spring 1944, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses every single day, more than Germany's entire monthly production of all types of artillery fuses combined. Sylvania Electric Products transformed a site in Ipswich Mills, Massachusetts, from farmland into the world's largest vacuum tube production facility in just 18 months. The company employed 10,000 workers, 80% of them women, producing miniaturized vacuum tubes at a rate of 400,000 per day. That was equivalent to 2/3 of America's entire pre-war vacuum tube production, accomplished by a single factory producing a single specialized component. The human cost of this production emerged only decades later. Workers routinely handled beryllium copper alloys used for electrical contacts, unaware that beryllium dust was deadly. Beryllium disease, with its 20 to 60-year latency period, would strike hundreds of workers decades after the war ended. Pat Vlahos, whose mother worked at Sylvania from 1943 to 1945, testified before Congress in 2003. "My mother was diagnosed with malignant mesothelioma in 1983. The doctors said it was from beryllium exposure. She told me she didn't know what they were building at that factory. Everything was secret, compartmentalized. The beryllium she handled every single day for 3 years killed her 40 years later. She was a war casualty, just delayed by decades." The production statistics tell their own story of American industrial supremacy over totalitarian economies. 87 companies involved, 110 factories operating at peak production, 80,000 workers employed. From university laboratories to Christmas ornament factories, from hearing aid companies to automobile parts manufacturers, America transformed substantial portions of its industrial base to produce the world's first smart weapon. The cost reduction achieved through mass production was equally remarkable and demonstrated American manufacturing efficiency. First proximity fuses produced in 1942 cost $732 each, equivalent to approximately $11,500 in 2023 currency. By 1945, mass production had driven the unit cost down to $18 each, equivalent to about $280 today. A 97.5% cost reduction, while maintaining 80% operational reliability under combat conditions. It was a manufacturing miracle that only American industry, with its tradition of mass production pioneered by Henry Ford, could achieve. The proximity fuse program security protocols rivaled those of the Manhattan Project, and for excellent reason. If Germany or Japan captured intact examples and successfully reverse-engineered the technology, the Allied advantage would vanish overnight. The Axis powers would gain defensive capabilities that could neutralize Allied air superiority and make the invasion of Japan prohibitively costly. The security measures implemented were extraordinary, creating multiple layers of protection that held throughout the war, despite thousands of proximity fuses being fired in combat, where some inevitably failed to detonate. Captain Samuel Shoemaker of the Naval Bureau of Ordnance invented the deliberately misleading designation variable time fuse, specifically to cloak the device's true function. The name suggested an improved mechanical timing mechanism rather than a revolutionary electronic proximity sensor. The Army used POSIT, meaningless letters that revealed nothing about function or technology. Workers in factories across America were told they were making radio components for aircraft or electronic parts for radar systems. Even the abbreviation VT carried classification. Gun crews were told it stood for variable time when they asked questions about the green-banded shells. At Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, security bordered on paranoia but proved necessary. Every employee underwent FBI background checks that examined their entire life history. The facility operated under such complete secrecy that local Silver Spring, Maryland, residents noticed groups of women arriving at night and leaving at dawn, leading to speculation that the building housed a brothel or illegal gambling operation rather than weapons research. Security guards were instructed to address everyone as doctor, regardless of their actual position, preventing identification of key personnel. Telephone calls were monitored. Mail was censored. Workers signed documents acknowledging that revealing any information about their work, even to family members, would result in immediate termination and possible prosecution. The close calls were numerous and terrifying to security officials. In July 1943, a dud proximity-fused shell fired from a destroyer during the Sicily invasion landed on a beach that German forces might recapture. Headquarters immediately dispatched a special recovery team by air from North Africa. They successfully retrieved the shell before German forces arrived, but the incident led to new regulations restricting proximity fuse use over land until the security situation improved. The ultimate security nightmare occurred in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. German forces overran an American ammunition dump near Malmedy, Belgium, capturing approximately 20,000 proximity fuses, among other ammunition. If German scientists had recognized what they had captured and understood the significance, they could have potentially developed countermeasures or attempted to copy the technology. Incredibly, astonishingly, German engineers examined the captured fuses and concluded they were propaganda devices that couldn't possibly function as described. Post-war interrogation of Dr. Hans Gerdien, Germany's leading artillery fuse expert, revealed their fatal assumption. We examined American fuses captured in Belgium in December 1944. We concluded they could not function as the propaganda claimed. No vacuum tube could survive the acceleration forces of artillery firing. The battery technology required didn't exist. The Americans were attempting to deceive us with false technical specifications about superweapons, just as they had done with other propaganda. The Germans literally held the proximity fuse in their hands, examined it in their laboratories, and concluded it was impossible. It was testimony to how far ahead American electronics technology had leaped, and how completely German scientists had been left behind. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.